First of all, well, I would like to welcome wholeheartedly our host. Dr. Katarina Barley, who is the Vice President of the European Parliament, and also in particular, not only she's a member of the Civil Liberties Committee, but she's also in charge of relations with citizens. So it's really important that she's here with us to discuss. And she was also minister in Germany, including of justice and consumers. So we're really glad to have her with us. So I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that I can hold the introductory remarks. As you said, communication is my responsibility in the Bureau of the European Parliament. I fought very hard for this actually, because it was one of the reasons why I wanted to enter the European Parliament, because I wanted to contribute to strengthening the liaison between the institutions and the citizens, which are, I mean, the way that citizens see governance is really a decisive part in governing, in democracy. And to me, it seems that this relationship has evolved, has changed during the last centuries, and is changing maybe quicker due to the technical developments that we are seeing, due to social media, due to also changes in classical media, I would say. It is absolutely crucial for the functioning of the political system. And of course, on the other hand, we see disinformation campaigns, which have become easier because of the development in especially social media. So I think this is really such an interesting subject, and I really hope that we will see a lot of results from your work that we can take into our daily work. If I may just raise a few questions. I mean, you're going to discuss this later on, but what does it need to build up confidence in a society? I think people need the feeling that they are being taken care of, that they're being seen as individuals and taken care of. And of course, that has different aspects, like the social aspect, the economic aspect, but also the democratic aspect, of course. And what we're seeing there in the European Union at the moment can kind of worry us. You do need also transparency. I'm also responsible for the transparency register. So this is also something that is absolutely necessary for a functioning democracy, especially nowadays. But we do absolutely necessarily need a functioning of the rule of law. And I know that there are members of the Rule of Law Monitoring Group, Anna Donat and Sergey Lagodinski in your panel now, which I'm also a member of. And this is what we deal with all the time. It's the questions of freedom of media, of freedom of speech, of independence of the judiciary, and all of this. And these are absolutely key elements to preserving the trust of people in your government. If you feel helpless, if you feel that you do not have any means of getting your right, of being heard, this is definitely something that affects trust and confidence in governance, and in your government in particular. So we are working on this very heavily. There are countries where we have to work very hard, as you all know. I'm sure you will go into that deeper later on. We will find a way of monitoring all the member states on the rule of law. And we will hopefully find a way of sanctioning infringements of the rule of law in a systematic way, also financially. Because obviously this is the only language that these governments understand. What I want to conclude with is that if we manage to implement such a mechanism of financial consequences, that we have to be very aware of not hitting the wrong ones, because what we need, especially in these countries where we see the rule of law under pressure, is civil society that is active, civil society that has the possibility to speak up. So we will have to make sure that by having financial sanctions on one hand, we do need especially funding of NGOs that work on democracy and the rule of law in especially these countries on the other hand. This is going to be a real challenge. I know that all of the panelists, including Domenec, Ruiz Devesa, who is also on the panel, as I know, we are working extremely hard on this, but it's going to be a very tough fight, and we need civil societies to support us. So thank you to all the participants. Thank you to Civil Society Europe. Thank you to the University of Siegen for your work. And I'm very, very happy to receive all the results and to work further with it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these introductory remarks. And before with no further ado, I pass on the floor to Professor Lahusen to present the project.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And you'll let me know whether you see. Okay, a very brief presentation of the research project. And basically what I wanted to do is to highlight what our main ideas, our main hypotheses, if you like, are, and I would be very happy if you would comment on them to give us some thoughts to consider during our research work. Now, basically, in regard to the call, this was a call of the Horizon 2020 research framework program. I don't think we have to speak about the relevance of the topic because it is a highly topical, particularly now during the COVID-19 pandemics and crisis. Not only because indeed the question of trust is a core question in the relation between citizenships and governments, but also because basically the question of trust is expanding to many other areas, trust in the media, trust in experts in science, trust in markets. So we do have a highly topical question. Now, what I want to do is I want to share with you basically a couple of arguments, three of them basically to keep the time. And first of all, the topic is trust in governance, in political governance. And here, basically, the first differentiation we have to introduce is that it makes a big difference whether you are dealing with trust in people, so trust in politicians and individual politicians, or if you're dealing in trust institutions or political systems. Just to summarize briefly, the trust in institutions or in systems is much more consequential for the stability of democracy because, to put it bluntly, you can replace untrustworthy politicians by elections, but it is more hard to replace institutions and systems without shattering democracy. So there, indeed, we have to be very receptive for different levels and forms of trust. However, what we argue in trust is that distrust is as important as trust, particularly because democracy is basically built in a healthy balance between trust and distrust. You have the power sharing mechanisms between parliaments, executive, and courts. You have the role of the media. So basically, there is the idea that the democracy builds on trust, for sure, but it builds also that we should not trust too much, that we should be skeptical, that we should be attentive. And the same is true for the state. The state does trust its citizens, but not completely. So there is, if you like, some form of a combination of trust and distrust. And we know very little about distrust. Healthy levels of distrust, healthy levels of distrust, forms of distrust, and the relation between trust and distrust. So I think this is something I would also welcome you to comment on this. Second differentiation is that trust in governance is also dependent on trust in other areas. So it depends on whether people trust science or experts. Just look now at the COVID-19 crisis and pandemics. And there might be also be distrust or trust in financial institutions or in markets. And this might affect also the readiness of citizens to trust or distrust governance. So we do have potential spillover effects of different forms of trust, which, as you see, makes the picture quite complex, but very interesting, because you have to specify what is the role of governance and what is not the role of governance. So do we have to spread measures or not? So the first lesson you can boil down to is look at the right balance. And that's what we call enlightened trust. So it's not a question that we say everybody should simply trust in governments or in markets or in science, dot. No, we say that potentially it is a question of looking at active critical citizens, active critical political institutions, and thus look at a healthy balance between trust and distrust. And then on the other side, look at unhealthy balances of trust and distrust. Second argument, which I would like to put on up front and would like to invite you to comment on, is we know, particularly in social science research, that trust is a reciprocal relation. So the question whether citizens trust governments or trust parties depends also on their perception, whether they feel being trusted. So if you as a citizen have always the sense that you are being distrusted by public authorities, let's say social benefits, employment agencies, tax agencies, politicians, whatever, you might develop yourself a sense of distrust towards political government. So the question here is indeed to look at in how far and in which forms there is reciprocity in trust relations between governments, actors, and citizens. And this leads us to our second lesson we would like to highlight, namely we say that in countries we will certainly have some form of cultures of distrust or cultures of trust. And if we want to improve the situation, we need mutual investment. So everybody has a share of responsibility. So it would be saying political actors, policy actors, stakeholders are as responsible to improve the situation as citizens are. And thus, it might be interesting to look at a potential path towards this more reciprocal relations of enlightened trust, as we call it. Final point I would like to highlight is, if you want to understand trust and distrust between citizens and policy actors, stakeholders, you have to look at trustworthiness. So what makes politicians, what makes institutions trustworthy, or what makes them untrustworthy? Now we know that corruption, for instance, makes politicians or political institutions highly untrustworthy. That's for sure something we already know from research. And we do have a couple of keywords indicating what are the criteria on which basis citizens assess politicians or political institutions as being trustworthy. I have just listed a couple of them, so just for you to read and reflect. But what we would like to do in our project is to look more carefully at whether this list of keywords and of criteria are sufficient, whether we have to add some. This is the one thing, and then to see which criteria are the decisive, which are less relevant. And third question is, are these criteria relevant in all countries, or do we have to specify country-specific lessons? And there we are with, if you like, with the third basic lesson we want to reach is, if we speak about improving the trustworthiness and reducing the untrustworthiness of governance actors, governance institutions, then are we developing a one-size-fits-it-all? So is there a model which is applicable for all countries, or do we have to develop country-specific solutions, and we assume that comparative analysis is necessary to develop different solutions? So these are basically the three general messages, or the three general questions we want to answer, and we hope to be able to find inspiring solutions. Now, just very quickly giving you an overview of the task and the objectives of the research project, so that you, if you have any ideas what we should consider, what we should highlight, you would be highly welcome to comment on them as well. So first of all, it's a question of mapping and comparing levels of forms of trust and distrust. We will then look at the arenas of trust formation, and we argue that there are several ones. So on the street, on the individual level, clients do make experiences with public authorities in their dealings when they are clients of social benefits, of social policies. How are they treated? Are they relations of trust being established on the street level? Secondly, we are going to look at political contentions between parties, particularly, however, with social movements. So when there are political contentions in the public sphere, is their trust being established or destroyed? And thirdly, we're going to look at the public sphere, the media, as an important arena of trust and distrust formation or destruction, if you like. We all do this with a sense for, we want to understand the causes of the construction or destruction of trust relations. We want to look at correlate, at consequences, in order to be able to look at scenarios of critical junctures where we think this is a critical moment where too much trust is being destroyed, too much distrust is being established, and so forth. So I'm skipping because time is running. Just giving you the basic aim of the project. So we are interested in developing evidence, sound empirical evidence in regard to theoretical but empirical data. We're going to look at the formation of distrust, trust at different arenas, compare countries, but primarily, and that's the green dot, we are engaged in impact and dissemination activities. So we're going to stay in contact with you, hopefully, and engaged with you with policy dialogue to provide you with our insights and get your feedback on your on our work. So I leave it there, just skipping to the people and to our homepage. When you have any question or you are interested in following our work, you will be invited to sign up in our email list and to simply show up here and there to see what our activities are and what our report is, because we have a very transparent policy of sharing as much as we can from our research work. So thanks for your attention, and then I move back and happy to hear your comments. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor. So I'm Brikena. Hello to everyone, and good morning. I will take over from here and try to have a table conversation live with a few of our speakers that I would like to thank you as well for joining us this morning. To all the participants, we are not live streaming, so we will publish the recording afterwards. But at the moment, all of you are muted, and if you would like to raise any questions, you can do by raising your hands, and we will give you either the right to speak, or ideally, you can use the questions and answers box. If you see, you have the chat box, and also you have a questions and response box, in which you can actually ask your questions to the speakers. Either the speakers can directly write their answers there, or live giving you the response. And we can track if all the answers have been given to all the questions. So feel free to use this option. And I will start with our speakers. So first we have Mr. Jean-Éric Paquet from the Director General Research and Innovation. And of course, the idea is to discuss a bit and pick up on what also Professor Lahusen just mentioned in their research. And from the perspective of your own work, of course, and your expertise, we would like to know a little bit more what you think could be highlighted, what are the key challenges related to trust and distrust in science in the current context, for instance, and as a result of the current pandemic. So if you could bring your input in that, we would really appreciate to know a little bit more from a science perspective. How do you reflect on this?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Brikena, thank you very much for this introduction. I mean, there's a lot to be said. Thank you very much, Christian, for your presentation. I find the project really very exciting, and I'll be happy to follow it as you progress. I'm delighted that my colleagues proposed the topic when the call took place earlier, and that is now kicking off. There are too many dimensions to be covered, so I will narrowly focus on science and on the role of experts in trust formation, and share a few considerations on how I believe that science can be more impactful in creating trust as expertise. And I think what we have witnessed with COVID-19 is a rather positive, even if of course quite contrasted setup, but throughout the crisis, we have witnessed that science and scientists were in most European countries, but also worldwide, a key source of expertise, and one which had an unusual level of legitimacy, both in the public to a large extent, but of course also a key role in driving public policy choices. And so this comes, of course, with a lot of impact and therefore a lot of responsibility. I of course, witnessed that as an interesting and probably a rather key development, in contrast also to the fact that, yes, scientists have enjoyed traditionally a relatively protected status in terms of experts, linked to the scientific method, linked to the perception in many parts of societies in Europe that science correlates with progress, including social progress. But as we all know from experience or in our various fields, this has been in the last 20 years for a number of rather visible and probably also good reasons, increasingly contested by parts of society. And this applies to varying degree across member states. But if you look at the debate on vaccines, if you look at the debate on GMOs, if you look at the debate on artificial intelligence, science is not necessarily perceived as progress, and quite the contrary. There are increasing concerns on technological developments and criticism that scientists are not always, and scandals on publishing and on unethical behavior in science, also in Europe, not to a large extent, but also in Europe, has of course continued to erode the legitimacy as experts of scientists. Now, COVID-19 is certainly a point of inflection, and I think the scientific community needs to take this probably at a moment where it can redefine the way it uses and builds this legitimacy. And in this context, I would like to share a few considerations on the side of DG Research and Innovation and the Commission. And Maria Gabriel, the Commissioner, is very much involved in trying to find paths where we can have citizens help us design science choices. And with that, give them also maybe a great understanding, but also then build up scientific expertise in articulation in this trust-distrust relationship, which I find conceptually quite interesting, Christian, to be part of choices made. This is not something which is new as such, but I think it is a process which needs to be now put to the forefront, and we need to reflect on how we make that credible and impactful. We have had projects also at EU level. Many member states are doing it, and there was an extraordinarily wide consultation in the Netherlands, for example, a couple of years ago to identify the science and research priorities at national and university level, and that's really impressive. But the challenge here, I find, is that usually you have participating in these efforts a number of citizens which are connected to science, connected to expertise, interested in governance developments, but this does not reach the public at all. So I think one of the, for me, most important dimensions, including of the project, would be beyond the conceptual frameworks to see how we can then find solutions which can be scaled up. Let me give you the example of Horizon Europe, where we are now preparing with mission boards, 5 European Horizon Europe missions in cancer, climate adaptation, oceans, cities, and soils and food. So these are 5 areas which are obvious areas of key debates, sometimes controversial debates, where indeed policy and expertise lead to very diverging conclusions. And in these missions, which are not about research per se, the ambition of these Horizon Europe missions is really to deliver a public good in society, cleaner oceans or better agriculture and better food. Of course, maybe a decrease in cancer cases or the quality of cancer treatment. So very, very specific European public goods. And the mission boards are now trying to engage with citizens so that the objective, but also then the delivery of these missions is seen as having been designed with citizens. So the first step is, how do you do that? And there are, of course, a number of instruments which I think most panelists are quite familiar with, which exist. So that's all good. And we will be doing it to a degree which we have not done before. And I'm quite pleased with the progress on that so far. But that's, for me, just one step. What is, for me, much more challenging and important is that the citizens' design effort takes place, but is seen to have taken place. And that it then with it creates ownership beyond the few citizens which will have been involved in the outcome of the mission and in the agenda of the mission. And I think this example of scaling up is one which is obvious across all areas of deliberative or participative democracy, very necessary, but how do you then use the outcome of these efforts which mobilize citizens which have ownership and which have already commitment, and how do you bring it then visibly and impactfully across society? So that's a few considerations that I don't want to be much longer than that, and I'm very much looking forward to comments in the panel, and Christian to then the project progressively bringing results, and we will try to see whether we can then also maybe use some of your insights as we develop the policy for the upcoming mandate, where research and innovation is meant in the recovery plan, but also earlier to really provide solutions, technology, social innovation in particular, to deal with our climate and digital transition. So in this context also, of course, being more agile and more visible and more listening to citizens and their design is going to be key. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this input. I take away that indeed citizens' involvement in science will be key in this distrust issue, especially now with the COVID. So we can maybe further elaborate with that with the other speakers as well. And some of the participants, I see a lot of interactions already on the chat. So for the project, quite interesting collaboration being expressed as well. So I will give the floor to the next speaker from the Parliament, member of the LIBE committee, member Anna Donat, right, if I pronounce it correctly. And from you, what we wanted to more know is how this links in the current framework of the current debate on the rule of law. So how do you see this, the role of trust and distrust in this current debate? What is your perspective on that, and maybe reflecting also on the project results that Professor Lahusen just presented? Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I believe this is one of the most important topic. This is the topic, or why we are talking about is the same reason why I started to do politics. I mean, I don't think I have to introduce to any of you my country and the situation about distrust in the system, in politics, in politicians. Although Hungary was not a part of this research as a country, but I don't think that it's needed to be a part of a research in order to know that there is a big problem, and it's not a Hungarian problem anymore, it's a European problem. Actually, all the results is something that we're facing on a daily basis here in Hungary. to just start with this quite ungrateful task to always be in a spotlight because of the country. However, I can tell you that first of all, when I was preparing for this conference, this webinar, I was thinking that how I can talk in a positive perspective, and then I realized that actually just introduce or explain a little bit what we are doing and how I ended up at the European Parliament, how my party became within 1 year as successful to send to MEPs. It's because I believe the only solution, which are not scientific, but we have to work with, is rebuild trust. And the only way you can rebuild trust is, first of all, facing the reality that there is a reason why people losing their trust in the system. I mean, in Hungary, in '89, people were promised that with democratic settings, rule of law coming to country, they going to get an answer for their problems. It's going to be a better world. They going to live not just in a freer country, but in a country that they can trust in institutions, which is more fair. There's more prosperity, more equality. 30 years later, even a little bit more than 30 years later, we are in the same situation. A lot of people believe that they were tricked into something that didn't change their life. Therefore, the reason why I'm talking about my country is because I think this topic it cannot divide from the issue of rule of law. In healthy democracies, the healthy democracies build on citizens' trust in the system, citizens' trust in the political settings, and citizens' trust in the institutions. However, if you are living in a country where the very first political tool which is contributed on a sense to show your trust, which is voting, basically results nothing. Whatever you're doing is the same system built up day by day, then you can't really ask people to trust. Therefore, you have to, I think it's everybody's responsibilities, but especially new generations of politicians. I mean, I'm not talking about age generations, it's just new faces, in order to take it seriously that people lost their trust, that people is in fear, and you have to fight with a system which build on fear and creating distrust, with propaganda, with demolishing a rule of law, with making people believe that where they're living is a democracy, but practically nobody is protecting their own interest. Therefore, I believe the main solution is involving dialogue, and more dialogues with citizens. It's not just walking the talk, but basically this is what we are doing, but start to listen. This is what politics forgot. Many people start to trust in the system again when they feel that they heard, that they are not just used as a tool in every 4 years when their votes are needed, but in between. It's a tough work. You always have to be among people, and you have to involvement on a sense that they feel like that they are part of the system. They are not used. And I believe it's really important, not just in a local or a national, but also in a European level, because we talk way much less about that people also lose their trust in European institutions as well, because it's way too far from them. We need to bring it closer, but of course we're always talking about bring it closer. How? First of all, European politicians, MEPs, are not far from their voters back home. Explaining things. My own experience, I'm brand new MEP, I'm doing it for a year only, but we are keeping, I'm holding forums every weekend, 3 or 4, quite tiring, but it's really beneficial. And you know what I realized? People in the most rural areas are way much more interested in little details. They are super critical and they understand what's happening. It's a stereotype that there are some people who doesn't understand what is the EU is about. Is not true. You have to listen to them, and then all their feedbacks for me was actually they know even more what is EPPO. For instance, for them, just the symbolic step that our country would join EPPO would raise their trust in the system. Because what if the most common problematic issue here in Hungary is corruption? Hungarians feel like that the European Union is financing a corrupt government, which creates more and more and richer oligarchs, an even more aggressive propaganda machine, which taking away everything they trusted before. Therefore, I believe that there's a lot of work we can do on a European level. When people see that Article 7 proceedings are rather slow and useful, why they would believe that there is fairness and truth at the end of the tunnel. So I was thinking a lot before that even if you're not a politician or a researcher or working in civil society, as a normal human being, when you ask what is trust, basically you can describe two types of people. One who says that the first you have to gain my trust, and then we can get closer and we can work together. And the other type of people who said, okay, I'm trusting you until you use your trust. The problem is that right now, especially in Hungary, we're in the situation, it doesn't matter which group you belong to. You lost that trust, and it seems like impossible to rebuild. This is why when you are working in order to rebuild that trust, you have to explain to people what does it mean, their participation in democracy. That rule of law is not a political philosophical question. These are not just words that we like to talk at the European Parliament, made by the plenary. It's not something, it's a tool to just punish the government, but it's something that depends on them. They have to fight for that. They have to require, because at the end of the day, if rule of law is stable and they can feel in everyday realities, what does it mean? Then they can start trusting the system again. So this is our job. And I think politicians has a particular responsibility in that, because we give a face to the system. We give a face to the process itself. So if they can trust us, they can start trusting the system as well. But in order to do that, we have to show that we are not better or more than them. We are one of them who just took a job to represent them, but how we can represent them if they trust us and we are not misusing their trust. In order to do that, you always have to give the feedbacks back. You always have to listen to them and take seriously whatever issues they raise up. Is not just empathy, it's literally active listening. And I think that's what's missing from the system, not just from the political system in a sense like politicians and parties, but also from democratic institutions. People doesn't feel like that those institutions stands for them, listen to them and protect them. They think it's something above them to just control their life. And I think this is the issue when we talk about rule of law, democracy and fundamental rights, that we have to bring back to the ground and have to show that basically those are not just terms and phenomena, those are their life. The life that they dream about, that is full of hope, that it's no fear, and it's built on trust.
Thank you very much. Very passionate and indeed very inspiring. Indeed, that's, I think most of us aspire to that, but seems so hard to work for the politicians to be close to the citizens, right? So, like you said, it's a lot of energy and a lot of time dedicated to that specific dialogue with citizens. But I think in this there was an extra, let's say, an additional actor that we didn't speak that much so far, but that I'm hoping the next speaker would touch upon is the civil society, what role the civil society plays in bridging, for instance, politicians with citizens or the EU with citizens. And I would like to bring that question to Dr. Lagodinski. Right. Thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to ask you indeed how you see the role of civil society in this building trust and distrust that was already mentioned from the previous speakers as well. And also the trust and in democracy in general. And how can we enhance this role? How can we enhance the EU role as well in this regard? So I don't know, what is your input on this? So we would be happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you can hear me. It's not always clear from the very beginning now in the digital age. But yes, hello from Brussels. I'm back in my office today. So you're the first discussion that I'm conducting after a couple of months from actually my office back here. I am a member of the Greens, but I'm also a clear liberal Democrat. I stand for the model of liberal democracy, not in the market liberal oriented way, not only at least, but in terms of, and professors among us would know, in terms of a model of democracy. And in that model, civil society plays a clear classic role. And I would like to try to go through that on the positive side, but also share with you some questions maybe could be addressed in as part of this project, questions that I reckon with for the past months and years, and which are more difficult than this model offers us. But first, on the sunny side, on the constructive side, I think that civil society is instrumental to creating, to strengthening, and also to benefiting from that trust relationship that Professor Lahusen talked about. Civil society is a creator, is an amplifier, and is a beneficiary of this trust relationship. And it is a matter of societal benefits, but it's also a matter of individual benefits. We have on the one side, of course, civil societies as a safeguard of democracy, especially liberal democracy. We cannot imagine liberal democracy without a strong civil society. Look at the German constitution. Right of association is one of the cornerstones, of course, of our construct. And this is also the case in all other countries. And we see, and Anna mentioned Hungary, but it's not just Hungary. Whenever we look in countries where democracies are eroding, especially in the EU, but I don't even mention the situation in Russia and Turkey with the countries with whom I'm dealing most of the time. Civil society is the first target, at least the progressive civil society, or the structures that are not under control of the government. And therefore, we see that this is kind of the last resort of democratic liberalism in a society is are the NGOs. We have, of course, NGOs who also amplify trust by creating transparency and accountability. Professor mentioned it, and by contributing to that, at least in the classical sense, by being independent from the governmental structures. And I think this notion of independency of civil society is something that we should be watching very carefully. And then I will go to the more shady side of the of this model, because of course, mentioning Gongos, for example, looking at countries where a lot of civil society has been domesticated, has been domesticated through funds as well. This is also a very ambivalent situation. How do we fund civil society? How do we create funding structures for civil society that do not lead to domestication? In Russia, as an example, there is a lively civil society, but it is funded by the government, but it is funded through the concept of apolitical or non-political civil society. They should do social work. This is how civil society is framed by the government. And there is plenty of money there to find, at least pre-COVID. But money, as long as you don't get involved in anything political. So independence of civil society, I think, is important. And that's one of the questions. How do we structurally create lines of life, channels of life, keeping it alive without domesticating it. And this is something that goes also to the question of diversity. I think that civil society on the one hand mirrors and on the other hand catalyzes the diversity in the society, something that stands outside of the rigid structures of governance and government especially, and by the feature of being independent, by the feature of being outside of the system, asystemic, so to speak, there are those rooms, there are those clusters that allow diversity flourish, that can be beneficial to the society, that can be also not beneficial to the society. Also, we can talk about this in the second part of my intervention. But I think just focusing on this societal role of NGOs and civil society is a small, important, but one part of it, systemic part. I think we too rarely look at NGOs and civil society as individual empowerment. People working on civil society, working on issues, trying to join forces, are doing it not only because they want to promote trust, not only because they want to promote a public good, but it's also a moment of self-expression and autonomy, which is part of it. And I think without remembering that, we will forget that it's not, civil society is not just an instrument for us. It has a value in itself. For members and for citizens who are participating in it. And this is a matter of reciprocity, to use the language of Professor Lahusen. How much do people see and have room and space to self-develop their autonomy and thereby to give back the trust that is given to them? And one more, the third dimension, apart from kind of the societal, individual, and the third dimension, which is important to me especially, is a dimension of Europeization. I think that civil society is the motor of Europeization that is sincere, that is authentic, because civil societies do not know national borders. And I see this again and again, especially now in my time as a member of parliament. I don't even know where people come from who address me on behalf of civil societies and NGOs. And to be honest, I don't even want to know, because for me, civil society is the nation, right? This is the country that addresses us, and therefore I see, especially now, post-crisis, we'll have to see whether crisis will actually catalyze the harmonization efforts here. I'm hopeful on that, but even beyond that, outside of this rigid thinking, even the judiciary, look at the Constitutional Court decision from Germany, pushing us back into our native national thinking regarding the European Central Bank. And here we have a civil society which is basically borderless in Europe. And therefore, I'm a rapporteur on the status of associations for civil society, European associations. This is, I think, something that we should address in the next step. We have various enterprise formats which are pan-European, but we don't have civil society formats that are pan-European from the EU side. So this is on the positive side, and just to finish it and to make it a little bit less rosy than I started with, there are a couple of ambivalences when we talk about civil society in terms of trust and in terms of its role in our democracies. Anna, the valued and respected colleague of mine with whom we discuss a lot on rule of law, said something. She said that there is something above the people, think there is something above them to control their lives. And she said, this is what's what actually the civil society can do, can bolster, you know, to break out of this notion that someone is controlling their lives. Well, there are many NGOs in Germany who actually believe, or civil society members who actually believe, that there is something above them and that this structure is rigged, and that they should walk to the demonstrations and demonstrate against some conspiracies. And the thing is, these people and these organizations are also part of civil society. And I ask myself, and these are the questions where I don't have answer, but I hope maybe your project could. I have questions with two segments of civil societies where we should address and think about how we deal with them systemically. One is a fake civil society, something that I mentioned. The Gongos and the less, you know, not only governmentally created, but maybe governmentally financed, etc., etc. And number two is the regressive civil society, I would call it. Our notion is that civil society is always progressive. Well, if you look at neo-Nazi pockets in Eastern Germany, what is their strength? Why are they strong locally in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, etc.? Because they do work of a civil society. This is how they win trust of the local population. And the question is, how do we deal with that? And this is something that I think that the good starting point is something that you mentioned, is impartiality, in order to win trust and to win legitimacy of our support as politics and as a system. We will have to also somehow address not the right wing, not the fascists, of course, but, you know, more conservative think tanks. We cannot discriminate. But where is the line? And how can we draw it? And this is something that where we're getting in a difficult situation. And this is something that Hungary maybe is a different example, but in a situation where the system is sometimes more democratic, let's put it this way. Maybe, you know, we have plenty of things to criticize on the system in Germany, but still it's a functioning liberal democracy. And the people think there's something going on and we want to. So where do we get the balance between a legitimate protest and something that goes beyond that? So this is kind of the more problematic part, and no answer from me, but a question, and I'm looking forward to the results of your work, and I'm happy to support it as much as I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very, indeed, also very inspiring contribution when it comes to the role of civil society. It's a difficult question indeed, and you mentioned very well that there are these two types of civil society, and they are developing even further. This difference is developing even further in times of crisis. And it's true that also coming from the civil society Europe, we also see a lot of distrust in civil society, which reflects also on institutions. So this is also an additional issue to address. I see that some of the participants are very inspired by your input as well, and are also asking for both you and Anna about schools of democracy. We will come back to that after listening to the last well, not really last, the pre-last speaker, Mr. Domenec Ruiz Devesa. I'm sorry for the pronunciation, member of AFCO committee. So thank you for joining us as well. And from you, the question that we wanted to address was more about the challenges of trust and democracy for the European Union, and how the Conference on Future of Europe can address this trust and distrust issue. So if you could share your input on that. Thank you again for joining.
Sure, Brikena, thank you very much for the invitation, also to Katarina, Barley, and the University of Siegen. This is a topic that touches many different dimensions, and we can see this with the panel, no? And someone has talked about the question of trust in science, trust in civil society, the rule of law. and I have to address the question of trust in the EU. In the EU political system or in the EU governance. But maybe I'd like to take issue with the question that was directed to me just for the sake of the discussion, no? Because the question that I got was literally, if I can read it to you, what are, according to you, the main challenges to trust and democracy for the European Union? That is okay. Then, how can the Conference on the Future of Europe contribute to rebuilding trust in EU governance? Well, in order to rebuild something, you are implying that something has been destroyed or deconstructed in the first place, no? So do we have citizens lost trust in the EU governance? Well, that has to be proved to me. I think it's a bit of a commonplace, and I don't agree with you know, this idea of putting the EU under suspicion in the first place, no? Unless of course there is some sort of sociological data to this effect. Indeed, even Professor Lahusen in the introduction said that the question of trust is also a question that affects national governance, not only European governance and other actors in society. And what I have in the back of my mind when I have looked to surveys from Eurobarometer and others is that indeed there is less trust. And I know Professor Lahusen said that it's not just a question of trust against no trust, but different levels of trust and mistrust and so on, which is an interesting concept and new to me, by the way. But when you look at surveys, even the more crude measures of trust, it is national institutions on average that come out worse than the European institutions in terms of trust. So unless I got the data wrong. But we have to take, I think, we have maybe to start the discussion from, you know, hard empirical evidence on the levels of trust of national versus European institutions. So I wouldn't say we have to rebuild trust in the EU governments. Probably we can increase it, we can improve it, that's for sure. We can always do better. But I don't think the starting point is that citizens have lost trust in the EU. As a matter of fact, at least in the EU, of course, and this is something else we have to differentiate, and here the question probably is well put when it refers to EU governance, because before EU governance, we probably have to think in terms of trust in the EU project as itself, or in the EU idea. And it's very interesting if you look at the Eurobarometer surveys after the Brexit referendum, how support for the EU and the euro started increasing consistently in a substantial way. So I think one possible interpretation is that indeed when there was, when most citizens or many citizens perceived that there was a threat to the EU, with maybe more countries willing to replicate Brexit, there was a positive reaction in favor of the EU. I think that's what the Eurobarometer surveys capture. And then you had an increase, a substantial increase in participation in European elections. So hard to read this as a problem of trust in the EU project or in the EU governance. Maybe there was an interest in changing policies, which is a different thing. Most experts tend to confuse problems of mistrust with the EU as such with, you know, for example, the rejection of austerity policies. They are two different things. My reading of this data, the Eurobarometer, the European elections, and also the fact that the far right did not really increase in these elections, even if many, on average, I'm talking, at the EU level, even if some, you know, disoriented journalists and analysts that like always to caricaturize the EU project said that this was going to be a terrible election for pro-Europeans. Indeed, it happened the opposite. So these three data, I think what tell us is that people differentiate sometimes better than experts what is the EU idea and the EU policies as two different things. And of course, there is probably an interest in changing policies at the EU level. And I think in a way, this has been also further in a way confirmed by the latest Commission proposal, which is tackling this crisis in a fully different way than 10 years ago with the Euro crisis. So in this regard, I think this proposal and the position of the European Parliament in favor of this proposal, I'm talking about the project of the recovery plan and the financial union, is very much attuned to the vote of 1 year ago, which is a vote in favor of Europe as a project and in favor of more progressive policies in terms of environment, in terms of social welfare, and in terms of democracy and values also, as Anna mentioned before. So in this sense, I will not make it much longer, just to last points. I think we need a bit more of self-confidence in the EU. Also the Commission, I think, could be more proactive. One anecdote I always like to mention is that when we proposed, because years ago there was this idea of the democratic deficit. Of course, our institutions can be, European institutions can be more democratic, more efficient, and more transparent, but they wouldn't call it that democratic deficit anymore. But there is room for improvement. We can have full co-decision between Parliament and Council. That will make European democracy stronger and probably connect it more with citizens. We should have a fully democratic council, which is not sufficiently transparent, and they take too many key decisions by unanimity. We need a fully democratic council. So more transparency, more democratic functioning, stronger parliament with right of initiative and with full co-decision. Those are the things that in a new treaty we can do to make Europeans stronger and closer to the citizens. But I also think that at the same time as important, and with this I can conclude, more than a democratic deficit, which I think, as I said, it was overcome with the direct election of the European Parliament in '79. What we need is to fill the knowledge deficit. And I know European institutions are a bit more complex than national institutions, but they can be explained to citizens. But national education systems are totally, are not in this game of explaining EU to the citizens. The same way probably most national education systems are explaining their national political system, in civics education or so on. So I think that's a key point. We will not make EU comprehensible to citizens just with leaflets in EU Commission or Parliament delegations in national capitals. That's certainly not enough. So there we need to be more proactive. And for me, that's even a more important thing than the conference on the future of Europe, because if this conference is going to be open to the citizens, which I hope so, with the format of these randomly selected panels, like copying a bit the experience in France with the climate change conference, citizens conferences. I think the way to do this requires some prior induction, in terms of seminars on the European Union, with the proper methodologies for common citizens. Of course, I'm not talking about university training, but it's hard for me to believe that we can just put randomly selected people, representative of society, in terms of class, gender, race, and whatever, and just expect them to come up with ideas for the European Union out of the blank. This requires, previous work, previous educational work. Having said that, I think, yes, the conference is an opportunity to increase interest and trust in the European Union, but starting, as I said, from a relatively good base, which is the process the process, you know, in the run-up to the European elections and the election itself and the aftermath. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this input, and you're right that, I mean, at least I can speak from the perspective of civil society, European civil society, that it's true that Europe is a model for many member states in terms of democracy, so we shouldn't give that, always put that in doubt about that, as we always do. But of course, as civil society at EU level, we tend to be more critical friends and try to improve further that democracy and the transparency of the EU institutions. And maybe a lot of the doubts comes also from the issue of having a very scattered and fragmented dialogue with civil society that the EU institutions have. So this is also a frustration very often of how civil society is also heard by the EU institutions. So I think this is also another dimension that we can further discuss. But I see that there is a lot of some interesting inputs in the chat.
Yeah, but one thing, if I may,
yes,
that's okay. But I wonder if in a national context, one will write how to rebuild trust in France.
You wonder if they will?
Yeah, I don't think in Spain anyone will write how to rebuild trust in Spain or in the Spanish political system.
Who would have to do that? The parliament or the people?
No, I'm just saying that it seems to be a different approach or language when we talk about the EU than national political systems. That's what I meant.
True. Yeah, that's true. It's a good question. Maybe, I don't know, within in the participants or in the speakers, if someone would like to pick up on that, or if Professor Lahusen, you would like to first pick up on the different contributions, what you take out of that, and then we have a few questions again for the speakers.
No, very, very welcome. These are really inspiring feedback and comments we'll certainly write into our books and remember them for the next 3.5 years we're going to work on. And Mr. Ruiz, Devesa, you are completely right. We have to be more specific in distinguishing which level of governance are we speaking about. I didn't address this topic at all in my slides because this would have complicated the pictures very much. But we do, what we know from evidence is two things. On the one hand, indeed, if you compare levels of trust in national institutions and levels of trust in European institutions, in most countries, trust in European institutions are better and higher than in national institutions. So you are completely correct. We have to be careful of not putting everything into the same box. However, there is a however. The people tend to look at the EU through the lenses of their countries. So if you have a country where the levels of trust in their own governments is low, the probability that they will have lower trust in the EU is also stronger. This might be for different reasons, because they have in general a lower trust in everything, in all institutions, or because they might believe that as their governments are not doing a good job, the EU is not going to do a good job because governments are going to impede the EU to do a good job. So you might have very different interesting reasons of causation which have to be analyzed. I think this you are fully correct. However, I think one general lesson we have to draw is, I think that indeed, and this is going back to what Anna Donat said, is people do experiences, and they very often do experiences at their ground level in their environment. So I would say that local democracy is a school of democracy they are learning. So if they have good experiences with local democracy, they might have a better view on national institutions. And if they have a better view on national institutions, they might believe that the EU is indeed also doing at least a better job. So I would say local democracy has to be taken into consideration as well. So I'm not contradicting you that you need to have a differentiated picture on different levels of governance, but I think there are interactions between them. And basically it's improving the quality of democracy everywhere, down to the down to the ground level of local democracy and the specific relations between citizens and their public authorities. But I leave it there.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
I don't know if any of the speakers would like to pick up on what was mentioned by the different speakers, or if we should look at some of the questions. Feel free to just unmute yourself and join the conversation. I saw a few comments also for Anna, indeed, when it comes to education about democracy in Hungary, if that played a role, like it did or not in Poland. For Mr. Paquet as well, how there is a comment about how universities, social engagement. So maybe if you'd like to pick up on that. So feel free if either you or Anna would like to.
Yeah,
so Anna,
thank you.
You want to go first? Yes.
Yes. Thank you. That's a really valid question, not even a question, it's a statement. Of course, the core solution is always education. And not just through the educational system, but lifelong learning and educate each other, educate ourselves as well. I don't think everything is lost just because, for instance, the national education system is not ready or not made to use tools in order to build up trust and teaching people about what is democracy. I can honestly say I was still in a lucky generation when I had to finish high school, that the political environment did everything in order to teach us what is the EU. I was a teenager when we joined the European Union, and also explain the democratic institutions, what does it mean rule of law, and what kind of responsibilities as citizens I have in a democratic system. But I have to be honest, still I learned way much more after I grew up. And nowadays, unfortunately, our education system is going backwards. Right now, everything is like, according to my parents, like in the 60s, 70s. Basically, it's a frontal education. Teacher says something, you have to listen, you have to repeat it, and that's it. Critical thinking is one of the main issues that this government is fighting against. Just look at how the Central European University were pushed away from Hungary, which was a symbol of critical thinking. Therefore, right now, in the sense, I don't trust in the system, and I lost hope that until we have this government, education going to be used as a tool in order to create trust. As I already mentioned, they are interested in a complete opposite, to create distrust using propaganda machine. So they always build up newer enemies to fight against, and the only goal is to build trust in themselves. That this is the only government. Viktor Orban is the only person who can protect you, who can make this country prosperous, and so on. Therefore, of course, again, we're going back. It is a rule of law issue in the sense that we have to fight in order to rebuild. And then again, I could say that civil society plays a big role. Right now, civil society organizations are the ones who creating special educational curriculums in order to fill in the gaps. But I could also refer back what Sergey Lagodinski said. We also facing the issue of we can't talk about civil society as a whole, because right now in Hungary there's two different boxes. One is supported by the government, and basically those are fake civil society organizations. They are the only ones who can get any funds and so on. And there are the ones who are fighting for democracy and rule of law and providing these educational programs. And they are, of course, Soros NGOs, and they are foreign agents. And it's exactly the same recipe what we can see in Russia. So it's all connect to the same issues in order to make change. Of course, education is a tool, but you have to be empowered to start using the tool for what is it for. Therefore, I would start in different levels, and this is what I'm always telling to everybody. You don't have to always wait for the state or for the government to solve an issue. There is a lot you can do it in your own environment. And education, luckily, is not just something that the state can provide. How I'm educating my own children, how I educate my friends through public debate, through arguments, that's on us. And this is this type of environment, like this grassroots movement, we build up and became a political party, but we are encouraging everybody then have to join our movement to do it by themselves. start locally, start grassroots, and start educate each other. Let's bring the culture of critical thinking and debate culture within our society, because I think that's the key for a change, which is going to result that at the end we can educate the next generations better or differently.
Thank you. Would you like to follow up, Paquet, on the comments that was mentioned?
Yeah, maybe I can say a few words indeed. I mean, echoing also what Anna and Donna just said on education, because I think in the issue of trust and distrust, one major dimension is that everyone is grappling with the complexity of the issues in the modern public space. And that complexity is, of course, made all the more challenging by the noise which is around us, and by the fact, indeed, that the level of knowledge and education, I mean, some tools like critical thinking, but then the level of knowledge on what drives societal choices, public policies, including in particular the disconnect in terms of information, not so much indeed in terms of trust between the EU level, the national level, and sometimes the local level, is indeed amazingly challenging. And this is where I think the project is right to put a bit of and I expect quite a bit of focus on key intermediaries. Media to begin with, I think they have the most central responsibility, which is exercised also to an amazingly different degree in national cultures, and depending also on the media. I'm deeply impressed by the way audiovisual media is reporting on EU affairs in member states like Germany. It's on television nearly every day. Whatever the thematic topic is, it's of interest to the journalists. They invest in bringing it in a credible and palatable way over to their viewers, and there's probably also, I suppose, interest in the public for that. If I contrast that with other member states, one which I know very well nationally, EU is on television only when there is a new commission or when there is a European Council with a crisis. There is absolutely no daily effort made by the media, also largely the written media, even if there, of course, it's a bit better, in conveying debates and choices made at EU level and informing the public. So I think media should really be a key component, Christian, of your work, as is indeed also the case for all other intermediaries. I mean, universities I mentioned, I do very much agree with the comment that universities have certainly a major role to play generally in bridging also in the science side and being an intermediate in terms of expertise, but then much beyond that, as is the case for civil society. And let me maybe finish with one last comment, which is to say that as EU institution and in my responsibility for the research and innovation department, the real question I think we need to deal with is in how far do we work with what we all call stakeholders or shareholders of our policies. And that, I think, is a way we have traditionally been working in the last 10 years, including, I find, more and more and with a lot of very positive input with civil society. We also work more and more with regional and city level representatives. I think that's really the way this needs to go, because solutions need European frameworks and national policies, but implementation is what really then makes a difference, including for our citizens. So it's all well, I think, understood across most of our, if not all of our policies. And yes, civil society is demanding a more robust framework, which is a very interesting and probably relevant discussion. But I think civil society has no difficulty at EU level to be interacting with all of us on a regular basis. So for me, the real question is, in how far do we have these intermediaries deal with citizens, and how far do we do it directly? And this is what I said with the Horizon Europe missions earlier on. In how far is this debate, and obviously you need both. The question is not, it's not that it's an alternative, but how much do we as the institutions invest? The Parliament is of course different, but I'm now speaking of the Commission. How much do we invest ourselves in forging a direct connection with citizens. And again, with then the challenge, not so much of how do you do that, yes, and we know how to do it, but in how far does that then really feed into policy design choices, and in how far is this then perceived as having fed into these design choices. So there will of course then be many other constituencies, starting with intermediates and civil society or stakeholder associations, which might not necessarily always be comfortable with design done directly by citizens. So shaping this is, I think, going to be an extraordinarily important element in the distrust in science now, and certainly also in public policy and public governance, including then at EU level, with the challenge of doing that with 27 different cultures, and within these 27 member states, very different societies as well. So what is already challenging at national level is an interesting challenge at EU level.
Thank you. So I understand that indeed education plays a key role, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because myself, I represent the education and training providers, so it's a civil society network representing that specific. And it's true that during the current pandemic, one of the biggest discussions was indeed how civic education, citizenship education can play a role, because this during the pandemic was undermined, and a lot of dialogue with civil society and citizens was sacrificed during the crisis because urgent decisions had to be taken and there was no time to consult them. So a lot of movement now on how to rebuild again this engagement that was sacrificed during the crisis. It was a major discussion during this period. So I see also that a lot of interactions in the chat, appreciations for your contributions. Is there any questions that any of you see that you would like to pick up from the participants? I see a question that attract my attention, although the question maybe is slightly off the topic because it relates to the US and China relations. So without commenting and Europe and US relation, without commenting on that particular relation, the real question is, will the citizens of Europe have a say in this? So it's an example on how we involve citizens. So maybe something, if you would like to pick up, if any of you would like to pick up, just let me know. If not, we can go to anyone would like to pick up on this? Yes, go ahead.
Not on this specifically, but yeah, on the last comments on media and education. On the media question was, I think, Monsieur Paquet, no, that addressed that, and then Anna, of course, again on education. I just wanted to be clear on one point. Of course, the overall role of education is very important. Indeed, I think it was Professor Lahusen at the beginning that said that the question was not so much about trust in general, but to have active and critical citizens, no? And a good education is very important for that. But my point was more specific. I think we need citizenship education. That was my point specifically. We need it, of course, at the national level, but particularly at the European Union level, because is a less known political construct, is often misinterpreted, mischaracterized, and also a bit more complex. Not so much as we like also Euro experts or Euro files. Is not so different, because after all we have a parliament or parliament and council, the legislative branch, we have the commission, which is the executive, and we have a court of justice. Of course, I'm simplifying, but you can take it from there to try to make it comprehensible. Now, I want to share you an anecdote that was very painful to me. At the very beginning of my mandate here as MEP, I did propose to the Commission, and this goes a bit to my point before of being more self-confident, to develop a voluntary education citizenship curriculum. And the answer I got was that violated the balance of competencies of the European Union. It's, yeah, for me it's very surprising. Obviously, if I'm talking about a demonstrative curriculum, but they said that that's an invading the competencies of member states. Well, I don't think this is the attitude that we need in this field. And I'm totally sure, as a lawyer myself, that there is no legal problem whatsoever. Probably it's a question of political will. But then I pose my question: why the Commission finds this to be problematic? And last comment on this: when we talk on, again, going to the original point of trust in EU institutions, of course we have to differentiate by institution. Because someone was asking me in the chat that the level of trust in EU governance is nonetheless low, even if it's higher than national institutions. And of course, we can do much better, I agree. But my question is this level of trust based on the decisions taken by the European Parliament or the decisions taken by Council? Because there is a big difference on how we take decisions in Parliament and which decisions we take in Parliament if you compare them with Council. Is this comprehensible to citizens? When these questions on trust are asked to citizens, are these questions differentiated by institution? And people are understanding the differences in the roles and the competencies of each institution between Commission, Council, and Parliament? Because otherwise, you know, what's the relevance of these answers we are getting?
Yeah, you're right. If I may, working in this sector, I hear the excuse of education not being an EU competence very often, way too often. Also, there is a treaty article that specifically says cooperation in this field is foreseen in the EU. So sometimes it's a lack of knowledge of our legislations on what the EU can actually do. And I do agree that there is a lack of political will as well. Although a lot has been done since the Paris Declaration when it comes to citizens' education. But it's also true that within the member states, there is a lot of difference of what we understand with civic education, and history plays a key role. And we don't teach the same history all over Europe. So there is a political issue there to further discuss. I see Patrick has raised several questions, and I believe within the participants, and I believe some of them were addressed. If Patrick, you would like to address one question, and we can give you the mic, maybe, if you will feel more. If not, I think some of the questions from Patrick were addressed by Jean-Eric. Yes, and I do.
Maybe I take the occasion to react to two topics which are indeed are from.
Yes, go ahead.
Mass media, this is for sure one very important arena where basically trust or distrust is organized, no, or formed. And indeed, we are going to have one full work package in our project dealing with this. So we are not only going to look at how in public citizens and policy actors, stakeholders discuss about trust and distrust in governance, and thus contribute to the erosion or the construction of trust. We are particularly also interested in the mass media themselves, because as Mr. Paquet said, we know indeed that there is a very strong effect, and there are some worrying developments beyond the pure negativity, which very often is attributed to the mass media. Particularly if we speak about news coverage about the EU, there is indeed a certain negative orientation. The more worrying thing is the polarization and segmentation of the mass media and thus the public sphere. Yeah. We know this from the US. I think this is basically the role model, the negative role model. And we have indeed to take this into consideration, which is particularly interesting because there is some relation to civil society. And this is the argument of Mr. Lagodinski, that there are two civil societies here, if you like. And they do organize also in regard to media and to dissemination tools and public spheres, which is deepening the segmentation and polarization elements. So I think this is a highly relevant topic to take into consideration, because it might also limit the possibilities of education in the terms you have been speaking about, because it limits the reach, the potential reach we might have when using standard media or standard public arenas of dissemination and communication. So I think this is indeed a highly interesting thing. And the second thing I wanted to say in regard to education, this is indeed a very important thing, particularly as you all have reasserted the lifelong learning element. And we have one work package in the project which is interested in the psychological developmental side. So we're going to look at children, at teenagers, at young adults, to see how far, when does basically the learning about trust and distrust in institutions, so in more complex entities, when does it take place, and who is basically playing a role in defining and with which consequences. And there certainly we will have, I hopefully, good lessons in knowing how does socialization, political socialization happen, and which are basically the actors we have to take into consideration beyond the pure school or a university, because we know that they are decisive. But apparently they are not those who are ultimately decisive for the long life learning element. And I think there indeed we still need to learn a lot. So I'm really thankful about insisting on this two topics.
Thank you. I think we have to free up Mr. Paquet.
Yes. Brikena.
Yeah, thank you very much for participating. If you would like to share any last thoughts, feel free. If not, thank you very much again for participating. We'll be in touch together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then I would leave Patrick that wanted to raise a few questions. And I think Professor Lahusen, if you would like to take up from here and continue the discussion relating also a little bit with the project and how this could fit to members of the parliament work as well in this very topic. So, Patrick?
Yes, thank you very much for you all participants for your studies, for your contributions to those issues, which are very dear to my heart, I have to say. I'm a board member of Caritas Europa, but I'm speaking here more on behalf of a not very well-known organization called CEDAC, European Council for Non-Profit Organizations, which I am sharing for a couple of years. And CEDAC has been quite instrumental in the years 1995 to 2003, more or less, in bringing forward the issue of a European statute for non-profit organizations. And I'm quite sad to see the way the Barroso Commission treated this project, which we succeeded in bringing to the highest sphere. It was even brought in the permanent representation in two different circles at the council level. And then the Barroso Commission said there is no support, and it proved totally false. Before we were asked to present the project in front of the council, out of 19 member states at that time, there was a general reserve from 7 of them. After we presented the draft, there was only a general reserve from 3 out of the 15. So it was a very small minority, and we could have achieved that. Why this project? Some question its utility, saying, well, do we need a European statute for non-profit organizations? The point is more than, does anyone in the European Union know what is a non-profit organization? And when you question officials, they say, oh yes, it's an organization that cannot make profits. So there is a total illiteracy on what it is a non-profit organization. They don't have a clue. They don't know that the key criterion is that there is a non-distribution constraint and that the financial reserves cannot benefit the members. That's the key definition, and nobody is aware of it. So a statute would make things clear. And I think the circumstances are even better now the UK has left the European Union, because they were probably the only country that didn't have such a statute. That's what I wanted to say, and yes, that's all.
Okay, I just wanted to say actually that if you, on this very point, the good news is that the president of the Civil Society Europe, which is also a member of the Economic Social Committee is working at the moment with the category of associations within the committee on this very project. So they're continuing it's not dead. There is still work being done to bring back to the agenda the topic of the European status for associations. So it's true. Yeah. Anna, you wanted to pick up on this?
I just wanted to say exactly what you are saying and double it, that unfortunately Sergey Lagodinski left already, because he's the rapporteur on the opinion on the same thing. My very first conversation with Sergey was about that. It turned out that partly from each other, we had it in mind that we want to push it through the European Statute for Civil Society Organizations. So this is how our collegial friendship started, and he is really fighting for it. I'm teamed up with him, and we hope that sooner than later it's going to be a reality. So it's really on the political agenda of the Parliament as well.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah, that's good news.
I might add that EnTrust finished the EU-funded project Horizon 2020 Transol, which analyzed transnational solidarity organizations. We indeed found a lot of evidence that this was indeed necessary, and our main policy recommendations were that basically a statute for European associations is necessary, because this is what many people also at the grassroots level told us. We are active in regard to transnational solidarity, so for people in needs in other countries or for the EU as such, but we are not able to organize accordingly, and this is really making our life very hard. So I do indeed think that this is important. And this gives me opportunity to react to some of the questions or comments in the Q&A, which are stressing that we should not indeed forget the informal level of civil society. So we might be thinking, first of all the NGOs, the formally established NGOs, which even have reached to be settled at the EU level in Brussels or wherever. This is a considerable effort. But we do have myriads of initiatives and groups which are either not formally or established at a national level or European level, but only at the local or regional, or they even are not organized formally. It's informal citizens organizations, and I think this strata of civil society is as important, maybe even more important, because they are highly dynamic. They adapt very quickly to upcoming needs, and they always bring in, if you like, fresh citizens. And we have been speaking about empowerment and about education, and I think particularly this informal set of groups or initiatives are basically this school of democracy, if you because it is new, mostly young people starting their career, if you like, of activism, of social engagement, and making experiences, very often dropping out because they make a lot of bad experiences. So that's why I think a view on this actors is highly crucial to understand the dynamic of trust formation.
Yeah, someone is asking, Mark Swenny is asking what's the name of the project, but you can answer to him in the chat maybe. But yeah, what we call in the civil society, we divide between organized and non-organized civil society. So all these new movements, less formalized movements that are indeed very active in different, more thematic, like specific thematics and topics that they care about, so that they are also very important in this. So of course, the diversity of civil society is very large, so that we should reflect on that difference as well. Any other comments that you would like to raise from the participants? Either Anna or Domenec, if you would like to, there were a few, well, I think we addressed most of them, I would say. And it's a pity because there were comments more to member Lagodinski that left, unfortunately, that he cannot address. So I don't know if you would like to continue picking up on how we move forward from here. How do we go ahead and what's next? Future of Europe was a question that was raised in purpose because that's what's next. and would be a step towards improving that. So is there anything the project can support this in this regard, or civil society could do in this? Maybe from the member Domenec, if you would like to say a final word on that. What
yes,
can we do now?
Thank you. Thank you very much again. And this is a very enlightening seminar. So I'm very happy I've been able to participate and to learn with you. From my point of view, as you know, I'm active in the Constitutional Affairs Committee, also in LIBE, but as a substitute. But my main line of activity here is in the Constitutional Affairs Committee. I think the Conference on the Future of Europe is not an end in itself. For some people, it's just an opportunity for consultation with citizens, to hear citizens, and a bit of sometimes even for some people it could be seen as a PR operation by the European Commission. I think it has to be more substantial than that. I think it should be an instrument for a real reform of the European institutions. It's 20 years since we had an official debate on the future of Europe. And of course, we debate about Europe and its future all the time, but an official, exercise initiated by European institutions. The last time was at the Nice summit of 2000, and then the Laken Declaration of 2001. That was followed by the European Convention and the Lisbon Treaty. So I think an update of our constitutional framework is long overdue. In terms of the contents, if you look at the Lisbon Treaty, it's already dated when it comes to climate change, when it comes to digitalization. We still don't have the Social Progress Protocol or the European Pillar of Social Rights in the treaty. And then on the question of decision making, there is an imbalance, and member states have too much power, and council is too, too secretive and too, not sufficiently democratic. So we need to tackle that. And I think we need to go to this conference on the future of Europe, to test these ideas with citizens and see how far they want to go. But for me, a new constitutional framework is an absolute must, 20 years after the last attempt.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add something to that, because I completely agree with Domenec, and I also have high hopes with the conference on the future of Europe. I think it's a good, not just a good initiative, but I think there is now political will to actually use it as a tool in order to lead ourselves to some reforms, because the EU needs reforms, decision-making processes needs reform, the institutions needs reform, and especially how to involve European citizens in the whole process, because that's create trust. And unfortunately, I see a lot of other things at EU level that would be a must, and it's not happening. And of course, there is a conflict of interest sometimes between the different European institutions. I still don't understand why the Commission, for instance, keep refusing to include fundamental rights and discrimination in the upcoming rule of law report. That's something that I think we should fight. Or lately, what I mean, I understand from the rational perspective, but if we are talking a lot about how to deepen trust and how to protect European democracy, if I can use this term, then I don't understand why this further cuts to the Justice, Rights and Values Fund. I mean, there are a lot of things that there were a political will already be building up, and I know that day by day there's always more need for money for other things, especially after COVID-19. And there's the new Green Deal, there's digital agenda on the table, and all of them are really important. But we have to be loud and say it out, at least if nothing changes, but at least make it clear that if somewhere needs to be a budget cut, it's always when we are actively want to do something for the protection of democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights. Somehow these issues are always at the end of the line, and without those, we can't talk about rebuilding trust, and we can't talk about involving citizens and dealing with representation and involvement. So I know my job mostly is to say the European Union is good, especially if you're living in a country like mine, where actually that's our only hope, that we believe in a deeper European contribution. However, we have to always also be critical for ourselves, that there's a lot to reform and there's a lot to pay attention, especially when we are seeing such amazing research outcomes. I used to be, I mean, my original profession, I'm a sociologist, and I was super sad that we are producing really great papers and nobody cares. Although researchers are not doing because it's their hobby. Researchers are doing for us to have tools and evidence in our hand to build up on. So I really hope that this project is not dying here, but actually it's going to reach political decision makers, and we can bring the political will at the same table in order to make change.
Thank you, Anna. If I can say indeed that that was also the reaction of a lot of NGOs and civil society networks when they saw the proposal for the next MFF, the EU budget, where indeed the heading 7, that is the heading investing in people, cohesion and values, was the one that had the most reductions. So it's kind of a contradiction that the EU is calling for a next generation and wants to invest in people, but reduces the very budget and the very funding that go to build and empower the citizens in order to recover Europe. So
but that's the Commission's proposal, not the Parliament's proposal.
Of course, we are aware that the Parliament has been very critical, and we support you. So yes, on that we are all allies. That's true. But indeed, how able we will be to not allow that reduction. Fingers crossed, and I hope you will be our best allies in that, and you will put enough pressure.
We'll do our best.
Thank you very much for your hard work as always. Professor Lahusen, you would like to say anything else, add anything on the project?
No, just a small comment, because I think most important things have been said. Just to add, I think indeed the question is consultation and participation, particularly in the conference and in the designing of the future of Europe. I'm just taking up the keyword Mr. Paquet has said, ownership. I think basically citizens across Europe have to have the feeling that they have an ownership on the future of Europe, that they are really involved. And I think for this, indeed, the question of developing a new constitutional framework and development of institutional constellations depends a lot on consultation processes. And here everybody, I guess, everybody has to take its responsibility. It is the parliaments, the parties, it's the governments, it's civil society, and it might also certainly be science, no? in generating the necessary evidence and information for educating or providing people with sound information. And I just want to highlight that the Horizon 2020 calls, they are really very timely in this regard. Just to remember that we are not the only projects working on trust. There are 2 other sister projects which are working on the issue as well. I think Ms. Professor Baragmian is part also of the audience. So I'm just saying, indeed, the EU, with the help of the Parliament and Commission, are investing considerable money into research, and I think very highly topical questions. Sometimes the problem is of reaching the impact of delivering the findings, because everybody in Brussels is so tight in schedules and meetings that sometimes we as scientists have sometimes problems in finding an open ear. That's why I'm so glad that this meeting, this conference could take place, because it's really inspiring of hearing your point of view, and it's for us, it's very, very helpful in refining our work plan.
Thank you very much. So I think we are kind of coming to the end. Most of the important issues were raised and shared, many different aspects to address that I hope will be useful to your project as well, and that the project could reflect on and bring some data and evidence to the politicians, to the members of the parliament, that they can use in their decision making and policy making. And I think research and education play a key role in general when it comes to this empowering individuals, empowering institutions, and mediating that dialogue between them, creating a language that we understand, because we also underestimate very often the language that we use and on the institutional level, and the capacity that citizens have often or not to interact with the institution with that language. So I think the research has to also, in that regard, adapt the language to the citizens, what we call the normal citizens, not the politicians. So yes, I don't know if there is any final remark from anyone. For myself, I would just like to thank you everyone for this very interesting debate and very inspiring. And I think the more discussions like this should continue to happen and feed each other, feed research and research feeding policy making. I think it's the best partnership we can see in the coming months will be key in all EU strategies.